Humans get cold in winter, and so we think our plants are also getting cold, and they need a blanket to keep warm. That's not really true. And unfortunately, it leads people to do all kinds of winter protection of plants that really doesn't work very well. Now, there are some good reasons to protect your plants, and in this video, we're going to have a look at a number of those, and we're going to look at the right ways to protect plants. Now, there's a lot of material to cover here, so I think this video will be a little longer than normal, but stick with me because it will save you a lot of time in the garden, and it may just help you from harming your plants. So why do we protect plants in winter? Well, one of the reasons is the temperature. If the temperature gets too low, it will kill the plant. Now, each plant has been assigned a hardiness number. I live in zone 5, and if I plant things that are zone 5 hardy, they will survive the winter without protection. Now, if I go and plant a zone 6 plant, that's one that likes to live in a warmer climate, that plant may or may not survive. And certainly if I grow zone 8 plants, they're not going to make it through the winter. Trick number 1 is to only plant things that grow in your area. Why try to grow things that need warmer climates when you're in a cold climate? I can grow lots of plants that are zone 3, 4, and 5 hardy, and they will all survive winter here without protection. You're much better off selecting the right plant and skipping the winter protection. Now, a lot of people know that the cold temperatures are a problem, but what they don't realize is the real killer in winter is moisture, or rather moisture loss. Remember that plants get their moisture from the roots in soil. And in winter, that soil freezes solid. And once it's frozen, plants can't get any moisture through their roots. That means they can't move moisture into the top part of the plants. And that's what harms a lot of plants in the winter. Now, if we look at perennials, they go underground in winter. So this isn't a problem. They don't need to collect moisture during the winter. Deciduous trees, they're above ground, but they've lost all their needles, and there's almost no biological activity in those trees. So during winter, their roots don't need to absorb a lot of moisture either. So deciduous trees don't have a problem in winter as far as moisture goes. The plants that have a problem are the evergreens. Anything that still has needles or leaves above ground in winter needs to continue to get moisture from the soil to support those leaves. Those leaves are biologically active. They're photosynthesized, even in cold winter weather. They need a constant amount of moisture traveling up that plant. And when the ground freezes, those plants can't get any moisture. Now here, it's not a case of cold that's the problem. It's really a case of wind. It's the wind blowing through the trees that's drying them out. So it does make sense to take your evergreens and protect them a bit from wind. And we're going to have a look at how to do that. Another reason for winter protection are the animals. There's not a lot to eat out there in the winter, so they start eating plants that they normally leave alone. Rabbits and moles, they like to come and chew the bark around trees. Deer are very hungry, and they'll come right up to my house and eat the ewes. Ewes are actually toxic to them, but when you're in the winter and you're really hungry, you're going to eat whatever you can. So it does make some sense to protect certain plants from animals. The fourth kind of protection has to do with ice damming. We have these winter storms that produce a lot of ice, and they hang on the trees and they bend down the branches. And if there's enough ice, it'll actually break off those branches. A good example of these are upright junipers and what we call cedars, arborvitaes. They have very thin branches and they're pointing upright. And then when they get covered in ice, they start bending down. And they can bend way down to such a point that they'll never straighten up again. That ice actually damages the shape of the plant. So it does make sense to protect those kind of trees from ice damming. But here's a much better solution. Don't plant those kind of trees. One of the reasons I suggest that is that people go out and they buy these trees and they wrap them in burlap, and that works fine when they're smaller. But these trees grow, and as they get larger and larger, it becomes next to impossible to wrap them. Here's a picture of some really silly looking trees in winter. They've been partially wrapped in burlap, but the tops and bottoms are hanging out. At some point, these trees get too big to wrap, so you either have to take them out or take a chance that they're going to get ice damage, and at some point they will. Or better, don't plant them in the first place. Plants with stiffer branches don't have this problem. All right, now you know why you're protecting the plants. Now let's have a look at different options for doing that protection. Let's look at keeping plants warmer first. There's a very common myth I see out there. People think that wrapping something will keep it warmer. It doesn't. And you can test this yourself. Wrap one of your plants and leave it in winter. Take out a thermometer and measure the temperature outside of the wrap and inside the wrap. They'll be the same temperature. When we put on a coat, that coat keeps us warm because our bodies are generating heat. We're the heat source, and the coat keeps the heat in. The problem with plants is that they're not a heat source. They're not producing heat in winter, so there's no heat to trap in. Putting a blanket around a plant does not keep it warmer. So where is the warmth in winter? The only place we have warmth is in the ground. The ground is much warmer than the air. Even when the ground's frozen, it's warmer than the air above. So when we want to protect a plant from cold, we have to cover it in such a way that we trap the heat coming up from the soil. That protection needs to go right down to the ground. One way to do that is to use something called rose cone. These are styrofoam cones, basically an upside down styrofoam cooler that you place over top of the plant. These actually work quite well, and I've written a whole article about this on gardenmyths.com. Check it out and search for rose cone. Here's a diagram showing some of the data I collected. And what you see is that as the air temperature drops, the air inside the cone stays warmer, but eventually that temperature also drops. Rose cones work best when there's a seal around the bottom between the earth and the cone. If you leave a gap there, then cold air just blows in and blows all the warm air out. They don't really work very well unless you seal them to the ground. Another way to do this is to take some chicken wire and make a ring and then fill that with leaves. Leaves are a great insulator. So a pile of leaves over top of your plants will keep that plant nice and warm. Now keep in mind that it's also a great place for mice to hang out. And mice will eat that plant inside. So be careful which kind of plants you protect with the leaves. Another good idea is not to put the leaves on plants until quite late in the winter season. By that time, your rodents have found their home and they've dug out a little hole where they're going to spend the winter, and they're less likely to move into the pile of leaves. You can also cover your plants with soil or mulch. Many years ago when I grew a lot of roses, that was a common practice. We'd cover up the roses every winter with soil, and that soil would keep the bud union safe from the winter cold. And in spring, we remove the soil and the rose starts growing again. Now, I don't do that anymore because it's a lot of trouble. What I do now is I just select roses that are winter hardy. Then I don't have to protect them. But covering with soil does work. Here are some solutions I see online all the time, and they don't work. People wrap their plants with burlap. That does nothing to keep them warmer. Something else people like to use is bubble wrap. Bubble wrap insulates. It lets the sun go in and warm up the inside, and then it traps heat. And that sounds like a good idea. But the worst thing you can do with plants in the wintertime is give them high cycles of warm, cold, warm, cold. That is more deadly than a cold temperature all the time. Never use bubble wrap to protect plants in winter. It's the worst thing you could use. If you wrap something, make sure it keeps the sun out from inside. Again, wrapping is completely useless unless you trap that heat from the ground. How do we protect plants from drying out, from that wind coming along and blowing all the moisture off the plant? Well, first of all, remember that this is really only a problem with evergreen. Anything that's deciduous, anything that loses its leaves is not an issue. It doesn't lose much moisture in winter. But evergreens do. And you can wrap the evergreens. That will prevent the wind from blowing through the trees, and that will reduce moisture loss. So if your cedars had brown needles in spring, that's due to moisture loss. And if you wrap them, you can reduce the amount of moisture loss. Another thing that probably works better is to take something solid like some wood and just make a little covering. And you usually just cover two sides on the windy side. That prevents wind from hitting the plants. That works much better than burlap, but of course it's a little more work putting that on your plant. Again, bubble wrap would work. It keeps the wind out, but that will also harm your plant, so stay away from the bubble wrap. To be honest, the best solution, plant something that isn't bothered by the wind. Lots of evergreens grow in my Zone 5 garden that never get winter burn. Pick the right plant and you don't have to protect it in winter. There is another solution out there. It's called an anti-desiccant spray. It's something you spray on the plants and it coats the leaves so that there's no moisture loss. It's like covering them with a waxy layer and keeps them moist. Now that does reduce moisture loss, but it also harms the plant. This material gets in the pores in the leaves, stops photosynthesis from happening, and it's not good for plants. Don't use anti-desiccant sprays. How do we protect our plants from rodents and deer? Well, there are a couple of options here. First thing is to figure out what your problem is. And most of you don't have deer, so you only have to worry about the bottom 2 feet of a tree. Things like mice and moles, they like to travel under the snow, and so they'll attack the tree right where the trunk and the soil meet. Rabbits, on the other hand, they tend to stay above the soil. So as you get more and more snow building up, the rabbits eat the plant higher and higher up. So if you're protecting against rabbits, you have to make sure that your protection goes high enough so that it's about 2 feet above your high snow line. Now, deer are larger animals and they can reach pretty high up, so we have to protect them up to 8-10 feet. Something that works very well for trees is the tree guards. These are plastic wraps that you simply twirl around the trunk, and they work really well. They're easily put on the tree. They push right down to the soil level, so it keeps the small rodents away as well. As the tree trunk grows, these spirals expand, and so you can leave them on the plants year long, but it's actually suggested that you take them off in summer. And the reason is that insects get in between the trunk and the plastic. It's a perfect place for them to hide, and then they might do damage to your trunk. So the best practice is take them off in spring, put them back on in fall. But to be quite honest with you, I leave mine on all the time, and it never harmed any plants. My preferred way to protect these is actually with chicken wire. And I make a ring of chicken wire that's larger than the trunk. You don't want any animals sticking their nose through the chicken wire, so don't wrap it tight on the trunk. You want it several inches away from the trunk. I put that on. You can buy it at different heights, so I can buy it high enough for the rabbit. And I put that around my trees, and I just leave it all the time. It allows lots of airflow. It allows moisture from the trunk to leave the plant. So leave it there all summer and winter. It doesn't matter. It stays on for years until the trunk gets big enough. Now these rodents, they prefer to eat deciduous trees, particularly things like apples and cherries. They will go after evergreens, however, when they get really hungry. So you might want to protect all of your trees. The other reason I like chicken wire is it also works around shrubs, right? Shrubs have multiple stems, and those guards are kind of useless for shrubs for that reason. But if you take chicken wire, you just make a larger ring, put it around all the stems, and it protects them really well. Now, burlap wraps aren't very good for the small rodents. They'll just crawl underneath it. But it does work quite well for deer. I'd mentioned the ewes in the front of my house. And in winter, the deer will come and nibble those. And if I cover them with burlap, it's just enough to deter the deer. I mean, I'm sure they could rip the burlap off and find the greenery. Deer aren't that ambitious, and once I cover them with burlap, they do leave the ewes alone. Another solution is an animal repellent spray. There's a variety of products on the market. You either spray directly from the bottle, or sometimes you mix it up and then spray it. And these do work. They work particularly well for the smaller rodents and rabbits. They don't work really well for deer because when deer are really hungry, this spray won't stop them. Studies have shown that it only works about 50% of the time. The other problem with the sprays is that you have to continually apply them. So I think about once a month you have to respray your plants, and that's going to happen all winter long. So I don't really find that as a very good solution. It might be a good idea if you have one or two special plants you're trying to protect, but if you have a larger garden, you have to go out in the wintertime and spray all these. That doesn't make any sense to me. The fourth problem we need to protect against is ice damage. This is really only a problem with some of the evergreens that are upright that have very weak branches, like the junipers, for example. Wrapping in burlap does work because what the burlap does is it holds these branches close to the center trunk. The heavy ice won't take a branch and bend it down like this because the burlap is keeping it vertical. So a burlap wrap does work for this. Again, remember that as the tree grows, you need more and more burlap every winter. Another solution that's actually easier to use and works just as well is just string. If you've ever gone and bought a cut Christmas tree, you'll notice that there's string around them and they're wrapped really tight. Now they do that for shipping purposes, but you can do the same in your garden. Just take any old string, tie it at the bottom around the trunk, and then just wrap it around in a spiral going up the plant. String needs to be about 4 or 5 inches apart, round and around and around. All you're trying to do is tighten up the branches a little bit, keep them tight along the trunk, and keep them from splaying out with ice. The string is very effective and is easier to put on than burlap. Now what I like to use for this is jute, because jute is biodegradable, and then you can just cut it and drop it in the garden and it'll decompose the next summer. Another way that works really well is to use wood. You take 2 pieces of flat board and just make a kind of a teepee shape over top of the plant. When ice comes, it hits the wood and stays on the wood and it never goes on your plant. Again, very effective, but how often are you going to do this? I mean, this works for small plants, but it doesn't really work for large plants. The best solution for ice damage, just don't buy the wrong kind of plants. Upright junipers and upright cedars, they're a problem. Pines and spruces, they generally don't have this kind of a problem, especially if you're pruning them to a single leader. So there you have it. That's my advice for winter protection. First thing to do is plant things that don't need protection. Saves you a lot of trouble. I grow 3,000 different things. I don't protect any of them in the wintertime. Now, since you're interested in winter protection, it must be fall where you live. If you want to know how to clean up your garden in fall, have a look at this video right here. It's going to save you a lot of time in fall.